I was thinking about coming here this evening, and I was reminded of how over the years I've been asked back to my college at Cambridge, where I read English, to occasionally give talks to the undergraduates. And I'm always massively outmaneuvered and outclassed by them, who seem to know the plays infinitely better than I do. So I always leave these sessions going, note to self, never give a talk on Shakespeare. People know them and are much brighter than you are. So it's with some trepidation that I embark this evening on talking to you all. And I think perhaps before I do, the question of audience is interesting and, of course, central to my job as a director. So maybe I can begin, in fact, by asking some questions of all of you for a moment. So I wonder whether it would be possible for people to put their hands up if they work in the theatre. Yes, good. Okay, right, yes, okay, very good. And I wonder if I could ask who teaches Shakespeare, teaches literature, teaches academics. Oh, that's good. Excellent. And lastly, let me ask you to raise your hand if you have not ever read or seen a play by Shakespeare. Wow. Great. So I guess immediately what that calls to mind is that he's a presence in all of our lives. And however much I talk this evening, I hope that we'll all, as I'm talking, be thinking of associations and questions and experiences that you've had with this extraordinary writer. And that if I speak for about 15 minutes or so to get us going, it would be lovely then to stop and pause and have some questions and experiences from all of you, and then I can go on from there. So look, I'm going to refer to my notes a little bit. I hope that's okay. I'll try and maintain maximum contact as possible while I'm doing so. And let's get started. Well, look, Shakespeare, last year, I spent my whole year directing his work. In fact, I did 3 of his plays in 1 year, Hamlet, Antony and Cleopatra, and Timon of Athens, 3 tragedies. And it's those 3 plays that I want to dwell on this evening as my kind of source material as I think about this man and what he might be saying to us. Shakespeare, of course, knew the power of beginnings, and he starts his study of melancholy, murder, and metaphysical doubt on the windswept battlements of a castle fortified for war. Yes, the title of my talk tonight is Who's There? The call that comes out of the darkness. And so begins, indeed, a quest that proves part thriller, part family tragedy, but finally an ever-deepening search for what lies under the surface, a search for what resides at the center of our being, in our heart of hearts, as Hamlet will later say. But let's start, shall we, with the man himself and a few facts of standard biography. We know that Shakespeare was very famous in his own lifetime. Only a few years after his death, Ben Jonson, his fellow playwright, wrote, well, he celebrated him as the wonder of our stage and the star of poets. The plays themselves were collected together by 2 of his friends, John Hemming and Henry Condell, who, alongside Richard Burbage, the actor from Shakespeare's company that, of course, first played Hamlet, Antony, King Lear, they were both actors, and we know that in his will, he left them, those 3, 26 shillings and 8 pence each, 1 mark, to buy mourning rings. They were colleagues and friends, and in the will, Shakespeare refers to them as his fellows. Now, there is a theory that Stanley Wells, the great Shakespeare critic, has put forward that really what these bequests were about was a kind of informal contract for these 3 men to oversee the 1623 edition of his collected plays, which they then did, which is known as the First Folio. Like Shakespeare, Hemming and Condell acted, they invested in businesses, they were part sharers in the Globe and acquired real estate. They lived in the parish of St Mary's, Aldenbury, less than 10 minutes walk away from Silver Street, where in 1604, and probably for longer, Shakespeare was lodging with his Huguenot friends, the Mountjoys. So these 2 men, they bring out the First Folio in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. 18 of the 36 plays, including Julius Caesar, Macbeth, and Antony and Cleopatra, and The Tempest, were published here for the first time. Without that First Folio, without that active editorial gathering, those plays would have been lost forever. The two men wrote that Shakespeare wrote his plays with great facility. What he thought, they claimed, he uttered with that easiness that we have scarce received from him a blot in his papers. But they didn't say anything more about their dear friend and their once collaborator. It was these guys that chose to arrange the plays by genre. So they decided what play was a comedy, what play was a tragedy, what play was a history. And of course, we've been debating ever since about whether we agree with them. But they didn't note when or in what order Shakespeare wrote the plays. And since then, we've been trying to work out the dating of the plays ever since. More importantly, the stuff that we'd usually depend on for a life story, for a biography, are missing. We don't have any letters or diaries. We have no contemporary memoirs or interviews, no books with revealing marginalia or notes, no first drafts. We have a will, a baptism certificate, some signed property deeds, and that's it. So, knowing so little about the outer, how are we ever going to chart the inner? Well, we have to be subtle detectives and try and distinguish, as Yeats would say, the dancer from the dance. Where do we start? Well, we start and we end with the plays themselves. But there are so many. How could I possibly stand here today and make a claim to know Shakespeare, to know what he feels, know what he wants, when there's such a vast array of characters and stories and texts? Well, over the last year, of course, I've been thinking that very question as I spent every single day, 365 days, pretty much, with his work, with him, with his sensibility, trying to look out for clues. And what I've discovered is that there are certain moments in the theatre, I'm sure you've all experienced them, when time stops. When there's a feeling of a kind of suspension. And I would argue that it's in those moments we can feel a kind of clue or sensation that guides us into the sensibility of this extraordinary artist. But before I talk about such moments that happened to me over the last year in his plays, I want to introduce you to a moment, if I may, from 458 BC, and a moment in the only extant trilogy of Greek plays that we have left, the Oresteia, of course, by Aeschylus. Now, there is a moment in the second play when Orestes is trying to decide whether to kill his mother. It's a high-stakes moment, and he turns to his son, his mother is begging him to spare her life. And he turns to his friend Pylades, and he says, "What shall I do, Pylades? Be shamed to kill my mother?" And Pylades replies, "What then becomes of the oracles? What of sworn oaths? Count all men hateful to you?" He replies, "I judge that you win. Your advice is good." Orestes, in a moment of high drama, then kills his mother. And the sequence of events continues that as punishment, Orestes is visited by the Furies, this external embodiment of madness. And the third play is when the first law court, the first jury, is created, because no one can get to the bottom of whether Orestes was right or wrong to kill his mother in revenge for his mother killing his father. I speak about this moment because here is a pause, and arguably it's the first time someone in the circle of plays has said, "Am I right or am I wrong?" Up until this moment, wife has killed husband, father killed daughter, uncle killed nephew, without any question or uncertainty. And Orestes has inserted a pause during which he scans his imminent deed before performing it. And for this moment, it's argued, an action has the possibility of being the right thing to do and suddenly the wrong thing to do. Up to now, reactions have bred reactions, revenge has bred revenge, but now someone has articulated ambivalence. And where does this feeling, this question come from? Well, perhaps it's from empathy. He's touched by the suffering of his mother. Or perhaps from another arresting and mysterious internal presence that the Greeks did not have a word for. Something more complex, mutable, and profound, and that word, I would suggest, is conscience. Let's pause for a moment ourselves and think about this word. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as privity of knowledge. It first came into the English language during the 14th century, and according to the OED that I checked this afternoon, the earliest recorded entry we have for it is in 1325, when it replaced the beautiful sounding Middle English word inwit. By 1611, it starts to mean inmost thought of the heart and mind, and acquiring a sense of an internal recognition of the moral quality of one's motives and actions, the facility or principle which pronounces upon the moral quality of one's actions or motives, approving the right and condemning the wrong. Well, enter Shakespeare. From Orestes' brief moment of pause, we leap to Brutus in Julius Caesar. I'll share these lines with you if I may. Since Cassius first did wet me against Caesar, I have not slept. Between the acting of a dreadful thing and the first motion, all the interim is like a phantasma or a hideous dream. The genius and the moral instruments are then in council, and the state of man, like to a little kingdom, suffers then the nature of an insurrection. Shakespeare is fascinated by what happens between when you're faced with the idea of having to do something, the first motion, and actually doing it, the acting of a dreadful thing. Shakespeare, I'm realizing, is drawn to the space between thinking and doing. How this interim, this conscience, can be a source of torture for us as well as a source of calm. And Shakespeare, I would argue, began to see that this space is a space for huge drama, that conscience, this inward faculty, trying to negotiate between right and wrong, is in fact one of the keys to his whole tragic output. What's my great example? Well, Hamlet is the longest and greatest, in my opinion, of Shakespeare's tragedies, and it's almost all interim. It's almost all thinking. Hamlet's father tells him to revenge his murder, and 4.5 hours later, if you do it uncut, he finally does it. And of course, it's a play that's obsessed with this word conscience. It occurs 7 times in the play. Hamlet concludes Act 2 with his plan, "The play's the thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king." And later Claudius will remark, "How smart a lash that speech doth give my conscience." And finally, Hamlet will utter the immortal lines that many of this audience will know off by heart. "Thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and enterprises of great pitch and moment with this regard, their currents turn awry and lose the name of action." Once again, we catch the pausing power of thinking. On one level, Hamlet's talking about the religious transgression of suicide, but he's also reflecting on how thinking stops us, freezes us, renders action impossible. Now, a different kind of pause or stop happens in the scene when Hamlet talks to Horatio. Hamlet, you'll remember, decides to try and test the guilt of his uncle by putting on a play in which something like the murder of his father is played before his uncle to see how his uncle will react. And through his reaction, Hamlet will know whether the uncle is guilty or not. And he gathers his best friend Horatio and he says, "Look, I've got this plan." But before that, he pays him rather an extraordinary compliment. And he says, "Dost thou hear, since my dear soul was mistress of her choice, and could of men distinguish her election, hath sealed thee for herself, for thou hast been a man that fortune's buffets and rewards has ta'en with equal thanks. And blessed are those whose blood and judgment are so well commedled that they are not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound what stop they please. Give me that man that is not passion's slave, and I will wear him in my heart's core, aye, in my heart of hearts, as I do thee." Horatio is praised for standing outside of things. Hamlet is locked in a labyrinth of his own thinking, but Horatio presents a kind of alternative model, a sort of detachment, an observing presence that fortune's buffets and reward he takes with equal thanks. So, Hamlet continues the play trying to figure out how to think his way out of thinking. He gets banished to England, and there are dramamas, and he meets the gravedigger, and he discovers that Ophelia has killed herself. And finally, at the beginning of the last scene, he meets Horatio once again. And there's an invitation to take part in a duel. And Hamlet says, ooh, he refers to his heart again. He says to Horatio, thou wouldst not know how ill all's here about my heart. And Horatio says, well, of course, you must listen to that and don't do the duel. And Hamlet says, not a whit. We defy augury. There is special providence in the fall of a sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. And I posit that there's a third way of thinking there. It's no longer right, wrong, yes, no, good, bad. It's finding a kind of space, a kind of detachment that the world might happen to you rather than you trying to control the world. Death in Shakespeare, I would argue, acts as a kind of catalyzing, transforming, even creative force. Because let's now, if I may, move on to Antony and Cleopatra. Now, Antony is really the story of a series of terrible choices. Antony stays in Egypt for far too long. At the beginning, he's enjoying himself with his Egyptian queen. Then he goes back to Rome. He makes a terrible deal to marry Caesar's sister, Octavia, which is a disaster. And then he goes back to Egypt and fights 3 disastrous battles, which he loses. And of course, you could argue that he spends far too little time thinking. He's too busy trying to hold on to who he thinks he is or he thinks the world wants him to be, the triple pillar of the world. Now, rehearsing the play, I was always moved how when the last battle is lost and Antony lashes out and blames Cleopatra and threatens her with death, and Cleopatra, with her handmaidens, decides the best way to bring Antony to his senses is to pass on a message that she herself is dead, that she's taken her own life in the monument, and that's going to make him see what a fool he's been. Well, of course, the outcome is that Antony, on hearing the death of Cleopatra, becomes utterly shamed and convinced that he should be the one that should die. And in these moments, the last moments of his life, he has, I would argue, a rather similar epiphany to Hamlet. He says to his servant, Eros, sometimes we see a cloud that's dragonish, a vapour sometimes that's like a bear or lion. Thou hast seen these signs, they are black Vespers pageants. That which is now a horse, and he points out a cloud in the theatre to Eros, even with a thought the rack dislimbs and makes it indistinct, as water as is in water. I looked up the word dislimb in rehearsals, and it's Shakespeare's own invention. It means unpaint, efface. Really, Antony is talking about himself becoming indistinct. He says, my good knave Eros, now thy captain is even such a body. Here I am Antony, yet cannot hold this visible shape. The world-famous Antony can no longer hold on to his bodily form. He's moving out, moving through, moving beyond. He takes his armour off. No more a soldier. Bruised pieces go. You have been nobly born. It's almost as if he's taking his own body to pieces and throwing it away. Surely this is another metaphor, an invitation to see a character ungluing themselves from a role, from a position, from a sense of inherited self. And indeed, let's recall momentarily the remarkable lines of Cleopatra, who, on hearing the news of Antony's death, is reunited with him finally, and then calls herself for, give me my robe, put on my crown, I have immortal longings in me. Husband, I come now to that name, my courage prove my title. I am fire and air. My other elements I give to baser life. Dying, once again, a chance for rebirth. It's not a stop, but a space. It's not an end, but also a beginning. Let me, if I may, also just speak for a second about another Greek influence on Shakespeare that I think it's worth us dwelling on this evening, which is the Roman poet Ovid. Around the time of the birth of Christ, Ovid had completed his masterpiece, Metamorphosis. It's an epic poem in 15 books derived from Greek mythology about mythical figures who have undergone transformations. It starts with the cosmos being organised into the material world and goes on to include such famous myths as Apollo and Daphne, Daedalus and Icarus, Orpheus and Eurydice, Pygmalion. And Elizabethan education was organised around learning Latin texts by rote. And Shakespeare's near contemporary, the essayist Montaigne, described how my first taste or feeling I had of books was of the pleasure I took in reading the fables of Ovid's Metamorphosis. From being but 7 or 8 years old, I would steal and sequester myself from all other delights, only to read them. Ovid begins his great account with these lines, "Now I am ready to tell how bodies are changed into different bodies." And researching Ovid once more, I found these lines from a later part of the story. As wave is driven by wave, and each pursued pursues the wave ahead, so time flies on, follows, flies, and follows always forever and new. What was before is left behind. What never was is now, and every passing moment is renewed. Suddenly I heard Hamlet's voice, speaking as he does about time and the South. The last example I want to give you is to go and to speak about Timon of Athens, the play that I've most recently directed, and actually I think is on in Stratford-upon-Avon for 3 more shows or next week. Before I embark on Timon of Athens, I'm just going to have a sip of water. Excuse me. You'll remember, and in my version, Timon of Athens was played by a woman, so you'll forgive me if I refer to him as being him and also her. But the story of Timon of Athens, broadly speaking, is somebody who's extremely generous, a philanthropist who has the slogan, "We are born to do benefits," and gives substantial amounts of money to everyone in need in the first half of the play. She then meets her accountant that says, "Well, look, all this giving is terrific, but I've got some bad news for you." And she says, "Well, what? You haven't got any money left. Your bank account is empty." And Timon responds with enormous optimism, saying, "Well, that's absolutely fine. I'm going to go to all the friends that I've given so much money to over the years and ask them to help me out. No problem." Of course, Timon then begins a series of visits to the aforementioned friends who find very nimble excuses to not able to help. It's not a good time to lend money. I'm busy. What a shame you didn't come earlier. I'm offended that you asked me last, not first. And Timon becomes increasingly disappointed and indeed furious with humanity. And the second half of the play, Timon resorts, hides in the woods, and becomes a misanthropic figure of despair and hatred. And when I started to rehearse the play, I thought, well, the first half will be fine. God knows what we do about the second, because it just seems to be someone basically moaning about how disappointing people are for like an hour and a quarter. And yeah. So we got going. I thought, well, he's a good writer, Shakespeare. Maybe I'll have to kind of trust the project, and there'll be a surprise somewhere along the way. And what I realized is that when it came to the speech where Timon steps forward just before the interval and basically curses humanity, a speech that I was dreading, I discovered that firstly, it's really fun venting. It's really fun saying outrageous things and speaking with a kind of bile that you haven't heard this character talk before. And that the audience, rather than being somehow rendered hostile by that, seemed to really enjoy the almost kind of stand-up like abuse of everyone in the theatre. And then in the second half, as characters come to see her and the venting, I discovered that underneath there's a huge humour that Timon discovers, and a kind of playfulness which is completely different from the earnest do-gooder of the first half. It was as if somehow when things are removed from us, once again this Shakespearean effect that I've been describing this evening starts to tremble and happen. Very movingly, at the end, Timon, having got rid of everything, no money, she's in rags, suffering, cold, yet strangely alive, contemplates the ultimate sacrifice. And she says to one of her visitors, "Come not to me again, but say to Athens, Timon hath made his everlasting mansion upon the beached verge of the salt flood, who once a day with his embossed froth the turbulent surge shall cover." Waves, time, identity. Let lips let sour words go by and language end, she says. And very finally, before literally walking into the sea, my long sickness of health and living now begins to mend, and nothing brings me all things. Death, rebirth, death, life. Perhaps nothing does come of nothing. So, we see the conscience-bound self being replaced by what I would call an Ovidian fluidity, a flying beyond the reactions to a different kind of freedom. And at these moments, rather than Shakespeare eluding us, maybe the opposite is true. As characters feel their emptiness, or at least a space within, we can feel Shakespeare's own character most vividly. I want to suggest that space is a theme that Shakespeare was drawn to. Voids, wide gaps of time, emptiness, interims. He was the poet of presence, but also of absence, of language, who ultimately, like Hamlet, sought silence, who understood that becoming was more true to our lives than being. I want to end this proposal by sharing with you some lines that came back to me as I've been working this year from the Argentinian writer Borges, who wrote in 1962 a short story about Shakespeare's life. And it ends like this. The story goes that shortly before or after his death, when he found himself in the presence of God, Shakespeare said, "I, who have been so many men in vain, want to be one man only, myself." The voice of God answered him out of a whirlwind, "Neither am I what I am. I dreamed the world the way you dreamt your plays, dear Shakespeare. You are one of the shapes of my dreams. Like me, you are everything and nothing." Thank you.
Simon is going to take some questions. He'd rather like it to be a discussion, and I think he'd like to chair it himself. I have got one of these if you're feeling weak. And do we need amplification on this? No.
I was thinking that if a question is asked, rather than saving Lindsay having to stumble through the rows, I could just repeat the question again for everybody and then try and answer it. Or, yes, I mean, I've shared a lot there, and in a minute I can talk about some more practical things about being a director. But is there anything that people would like to say in response, moments of agreement or challenge, or even a question or experience they've had of Shakespeare's work, or their feelings? Opposites and good and goodies and baddies in Shakespeare, and whether they are such a thing as that. I think that this feeling of the third force has really been coming back to me, in that, yes, absolutely, very, very often in Shakespeare's language, he uses this trope called the antithesis, which is essentially night, day, black, white, young, old. He uses it a lot to make his points. And yes, there are undeniably characters in his plays, like Iago, who are evil. They do evil things, but they do it very seductively. And why they're so dangerous is because they are able to charm other characters on the stage into doing their will. And Shakespeare understands that characters that are very charming, very persuasive, and very clever are very exciting for an audience to watch. And I think it's helpful to remember that when Shakespeare was writing these plays, theatres had only really just come into existence. They were a new piece of technology. Up to that time, he'd grown up with troupes touring plays in village halls, in outdoor spaces, on the streets. So the idea of a building which you would come to and watch a play was still a new event. What that meant was, rather like the birth of Hollywood, I think Shakespeare and his colleagues were trying to think very hard about how to make the very best and exciting plays they possibly could. And this question of making somebody articulate and brilliant and dangerous, he was enough of a showman to understand that the audience wanted that. At the same time, we realize in art, judgment is often when we turn off. When we can sit and judge a person or a character, boredom swiftly follows. So he was clever at going, you think you can judge this person, but they're actually somewhere over here, now they're over there, and they're over here. Indeed, it's not until some way through the play that Claudius, in Hamlet, actually comes forward and says, yes, I did it. Shakespeare leaves it a surprisingly long time, for the first audience at least, to go, maybe it is all a form of madness, and maybe the ghost is not to be trusted, and maybe Claudius is innocent. Because actually, up to that moment, much of the first two-thirds of the play, Claudius is a very functioning, charming, attractive, and successful man. So, yes and no. And then the third force, which is this self-awareness, which is another huge thing that Shakespeare brought. And I guess that description of the monologues and the soliloquies is very much to come forward and go, I don't know what to do. I'm caught between two places. And then the audience starts to become the third force themselves. In terms of the audience start becoming a kind of intelligence the characters are leaning into and drawing inspiration from. Good. So this is a question about agency and freedom in Macbeth and how to reconcile yourself to that play. Well, I'll just open some. I have never directed Macbeth. I would like to one day, I think. It's enormously popular. It seems to be wherever it goes on in the world, box office receipts surge. And I don't know what it is about Macbeth that keeps calling people back. I think as a director, the problem, before I come to the text, of staging was amplified or demonstrated by my boss at the National Theatre, Rufus Norris. Some of you might have seen his production in the Olivier with Rory Kinnear and Anne-Marie Duff recently. And the challenge that he encountered was that it was a very, very bleak and apocalyptic world that they lived in, which meant that there was a play entirely of gloom and doom and darkness and misery. And I think the great challenge, going back to the antithesis with dark plays and studies of evil, is to, as it were, bring the sunshine into the world. Because unremitting darkness is simply going back to what's interesting and what's not enticing enough. And indeed, the question about agency, I can't answer. This is back to my Cambridge seminar with the brilliant undergraduate on the decision-making in Macbeth, but I can feel that discovering what Macbeth wants, where his ambition and that of his wife comes from, and why is that triggered so strongly, as it is by the witches, into making him feel like, yes, he does have choices. And indeed, I think, going back to heroes and villains, what I long to see in a production of Macbeth is a Macbeth that's really enjoying himself. Until he's not. Because I think we only really, and this comes back to me when I was doing a very long, some of you might have seen it, very rather difficult play called Strange Interlude by Eugene O'Neill, which is the first play that I directed at the National Theatre. And it's full of Eugene O'Neill-like agony, people drinking a lot, suffering, being miserable. And my young assistant said, well, I think maybe something would help us is to remember that human beings move away from pain. They make choices because they think it's going to make them happier, not less happy. And I think that might be a way into Macbeth. He believes that what he will do will bring him great joy, and his wife great pleasure. It doesn't, and he comes to a similar epiphany, again going back to this point of, I thought I had choice, but I don't, so how do I live in the world, is another spiritual question he's too late exposed to. I find it interesting, going back to the Greeks, that Ovid was writing his great study of change at the moment when Christ was born. So here is a moment in time when Ovid was writing the myth of reincarnation, how passion moves us from one state physically into another, and there was emerging the most profound myth of how a person can change and spiritually reincarnate. So that's a moment of time, and it felt like, for whatever reason, Shakespeare came along all those centuries later and looked back and said, there's something in the metamorphosis which is profoundly moving to me, and I'm going to put them into the plays explicitly. So we think of Pyramus and Thisbe, which is a direct borrow from Ovid in Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you go through the plays, they're littered with Nemean Lion's Nerve, Eye to Hercules. Like, they're full of Greek references. Timon of Athens based on Plutarch, as of course is Antony and Cleopatra. So he was drawn to the classics, and yet there is also this Catholicism, melting pot, the Reformation. Where do we stand with Catholicism? We think Shakespeare's father was a Catholic. So there are lots of mysteries around that, which makes partly his religiosity extremely occluded. But what I keep coming back to, I'm sure scholars have fantasized about finding the diary of Shakespeare. And wouldn't that be amazing and thrilling and liberating and fascinating. Of course, I think his greatest gift to all of us was that there is no diary. And I find it very uncanny that this lack of letters, lack of memoirs, lack of any notes even written in the margins, it was as if his spiritual position was to go, why don't I be like a character? And you have something that's written and you have nothing else. Nothing. As if his friends were also sworn to this thing, like even those men that compiled the plays. Oh, he didn't make any mistakes. And that's all they say. It's really extraordinary. Question about disguises in his play and how he uses disguises. Maybe can it relate to the central question that we're speaking about this evening of transformation? Well, of course, it's a wonderfully vivid account of being someone else. But he was particularly excited by changing gender, of course. So I think of Twelfth Night, or As You Like It, when women become men, and how that liberates them. And often I think of Rosalind, it's when she becomes a man, she's most able to find her own femininity, finally. So disguise is absolutely a portal into not falsity, but truth, which comes back to his love of paradox all the time. He's constantly taking an idea, reversing it, and revealing what you didn't expect. So I think disguise is an absolutely central part of his project, absolutely, yeah. So it's a question about memorization and letting go of one play so you can think of another. And what happens if you're in one play? Do you actually ever, as a director, mentally go into another one? This reminds me of a conversation I had with a brain surgeon academic recently, and I was talking to him about memorization. He said, well, you have to remember that you have to forget a certain part of your life in order to make room to, as it were, remember the new stuff. And I was talking to him about Ray Fiennes, who has a prodigious memory and is always telling me how much he remembers. And when I did Man and Superman with Rafe, an extremely long bad and short play, Rafe made sure that he was off book, as they say, on day one. He spent 6 months learning it, so he could just go. And I said to Rafe, do you think when you start a new play, you forget the... No! And I said, oh, right, okay, well... and of course, he was able, in the middle of Antony and Cleopatra, to recite a large chunk of Man and Superman to prove that it was still in there. And I think that the memorization of the Shakespearean actors would have been quite astonishing because they didn't really have rehearsals. I mean, they would have had a few days, and they only had their prompt scripts, which means they'd be given a script with only the line before they spoke and the line after it. Because it would take far too long to copy out the full script for every cast member. So here's your cue line, here's your speech, here's the line after. Boom, learn that. So their recall was remarkable. And they, of course, were playing these plays in rep. So you'd do 2 or 3 nights of this one, and then you'd do another this one, and then another one, and then a new one would come. And I think what's actually rather spellbinding is we think of the Shakespearean company and we think about Burbage, the same guy playing Hamlet that then went on to play Coriolanus and Antony and Lear. And I'm certain that Shakespeare was watching that man's life development and going, yes, I know, this Burbage will do this line brilliantly, or I need to not give him too much here, or and adapt accordingly. So I think seeing them as a piece of music, a symphony across time, is absolutely right. And I think the more I do of them, the more hopefully I can start to play on a wider keyboard of resonances, as it were, and certain things can keep returning. And as a director, one's vision becomes a little bit more distilled, I suppose, I hope. Eric, good. So Eric is just giving a stinging rebuke to Hamlet's behavior, his misogyny, his cruel murder of Polonius, his self-absorption, his carelessness with friendships, and his general narcissism. Is that a good summary, Eric? Good. Well, the first thing, Eric, I'm excited to invite you to an event that apparently goes on in the theatre that I'm somewhat dauntingly about to take over in Washington, which is called the Mock Trial, which is when members of Congress, indeed the Supreme Court, gather every year to put a character on trial. And there is advocacy pro the character, and advocacy indeed about why a character should not win our sympathies. And the Supreme Court judge then makes a decision. So I think you'll get on very well in Washington, Eric, with that provocation. I think that, well, of course, all that you say, Eric, is true. I would perhaps take a question with the murdering of Polonius, because technically I think Hamlet believes it's Claudius behind the arras when he does it, and is rather shocked to discover that it's Polonius. But you could say that he doesn't necessarily show a huge amount of remorse. I believe, Eric, that ambiguity does not lie in murkiness, but in laying one thing next to another, both of which have very strong energies and colours. So everything that you say of Hamlet's darkness, absolutely right. And yet, oh, this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. He says at the beginning of the play, I am not an actor, but those who can act well, the opening speech, a description of depression, heartbreak, wish to no longer live, if delivered correctly, should be shudderingly moving. So that the pleasure of the evening goes, we are vacillating constantly between bad, irresponsible, mean behaviour and some of the greatest poetry ever written. And it's that movement in between as we go from one colour to another that I believe is where the friction and indeed the pleasure lies of watching the play. And your question is germane to my daily life as a director, because going back to judgment, as soon as an actor who I meet in casting comes in and says, well, Hamlet, I mean, he's a nuisance, isn't he? Or oh, King Lear, he's kind of oh, frustrating old man, blah, blah, blah. That the magnitude goes down, the ambition goes down, and the actor's work will also go down. That I have to, with the actor, constantly discover what's marvellous and terrific, stunning about the nastiest, meanest people. So your question is excellent. Thank you, Eric. This is a question about death and its role in the life of Shakespeare and also in his plays. I can't help thinking that it's very helpful thinking about the plays that Shakespeare would have seen when he grew up. And I referred to there not being theatres, but there being troupes that were touring the country. And the great medieval smash hit play that he would have definitely seen was a play called Everyman. And the story of Everyman, very simply, is Everyman is a happy, free, jolly person who wakes up one day, knock at the door, it's Death. And Death says, you're coming with me. And Everyman says, oh dear. Who can I bring with me? And Death says, well, normally no one, but I'll let you have a go. So the story is Everyman going to friendship, will you come with me? No. Family, will you come with me? No. Possessions, will you come with me? No. And eventually comes and sees somebody in the gutter lying ill, and he says to the person in the gutter, who are you? And the man says, good deeds. And Everyman says, why are you so ill? And he says, well, you haven't done one for so long. And so Everyman then goes on a kind of process of very Catholic, because it comes from a Catholic tradition, then of flagellation and self-purification in a way that then revives good deeds, and good deeds is the person that climbs into the grave with Everyman at the end. Now, you could argue that Shakespeare takes these allegorical characters. Friendship could become Buckingham in Richard III, for example. Vice, which is in the other play of the similar family, becomes Richard III. He gives them names and he makes them flesh and blood. But crucially, Death remains the ultimate character. And I think Shakespeare, in his brilliance, in his interest all the time with what everybody shares in an audience. He wrote in iambic pentameter, which we haven't spoken about this evening, but essentially it's a da-dum, 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 da-dum rhythm. I would argue he does that because it's the rhythm of the heartbeat. And he knew everyone in the theatre shared a heartbeat. So to play on that rhythm is a brilliant way of holding your audience, as is dealing with death, especially in a culture which death was extremely present. And lastly, I guess related to that is going back to the talk, is that sometimes we watch these tragedies and think, why must I watch a play which just simply bad things happen? Aristotle said the role of tragedy was to provoke pity and sympathy. But I think really these stories can become stories of liberation. Yes, they're ostensibly about death, but I think what Shakespeare's saying is death is possible in life. And there are lots of times in life when we can either let go of something or hold on to it. And the phrase that Peter Brook taught me is hold on tightly, let go lightly. And I've really hung on to that ever since I heard it, probably when I was about 17. Good.